Good afternoon and welcome to All About Scoring, the Beginning Steps. We'd like to welcome everyone, and with us today I've got Susan Pittman, and I have Daphne Atkinson from GED Testing Service, and I'm Bonnie Goonan. This afternoon what we're going to be doing is we're going to deepen your understanding of scoring constructed response. And we're going to take a look at some sample writings and some scorings for the very different traits that we see, traits 1, 2, and 3. We're going to do an overview of the Educator scoring tools, and of course we're always open for some questions. So as we go through today's webinar, please, if you have questions, just type them into that chat box, and we'll make sure that we're checking that. As you can see, we have a lot of ground to cover. And so in this very short time, we want to make sure that we use all of it. So, Susan, let's get started and let's talk about constructed responses and what the expectations are for those extended responses. So as we look at the purpose, Susan, tell me what we think test takers should be able to do.
Sorry, I'm about to get ahead of you there. But really what we're trying to do within this for extended response is we're really trying to give test takers that opportunity to show that they really know the writing conventions in English and that they understand what they've read. And I want everybody out there to be thinking in terms of how this translates beyond the test and into the workplace and into higher education and training if that's what someone wants. Because we want them to be able to use evidence and build arguments and show that they really can communicate their thinking in their own words. Such an important thing as we're going through. So when we're looking at writing a constructed response, let's talk just for a minute about what are the basics here. Well, you have to closely read the stimulus material, and that student has to unpack the prompt. If they can't unpack the prompt, then that creates a problem, because how am I supposed to know what I'm writing if I don't really have some real tools to do that? And then I have to start working with my claim. And I'm going to build an argument, but you know, I have to really read closely, back again to that very first thing, that stimulus material, so I can analyze the information that's there and evaluate it, because I'm going to need to take, in that next one, evidence that's going to support my claim and show how it's all connected. And that's an analysis piece that for many of our students really proves problematic as we're going through. And especially answering that connection piece. Bonnie, you know, we have problems out there with our students who are saying, well, I can list the evidence, but they're not explaining how or why it's connected to the claim itself. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And higher level writing, what we tend to see are counterclaims and rebuttals, so that that student really demonstrates that, you know, I understand both of these texts, and I can show, you know, how this argument might seem okay, but it really doesn't support the best supported argument or claim within that particular passage. And then we have to draft. And of course, the thing that many of our students don't like to do as well is after they put all that writing in, go back and actually revise and editing. That is so important that students learn how to do all these pieces. And remember, as we're working through this, within that constructed response, they've got 45 minutes in reasoning through language arts, and then they have 25 minutes when they're working with social studies. So they need to be very aware, too, of time management. Contrary to what we've always thought, where you start out your writing with, okay, let's build a thesis statement, the reality out there, and according to the research, is that our students first need to go in and read closely, and they need to gather up that data, gather up that evidence as they're reading, so that then they can craft that thesis statement or claim that will work with the evidence that they found. We've kind of been going a little backwards on this and looking at doing the thesis statement first, but it's all about getting the evidence together, and then that leads us to then developing that claim or that statement itself. A couple of new resources, and these are absolutely fantastic. You have a webinar guide, and on pages 3 and 4, you're going to see that there's some updated guidelines, and also there's some quick tips for test takers. Make sure as you go back into your classroom that you spend some time working through those. Share them with your students so that they see, oh, this is what's expected of me, and also here's some ways that I can make sure that I am doing what I need to. Those quick tips, there are 4 of them. I think you're going to find them incredibly useful as you're working with students on these different areas itself. So, Bonnie, let's talk a little bit about prompts and stimulus materials. And tell me just a little bit about that prompt format itself.
You know, Susan, when we first started seeing the prompts come out of GED Testing Service, you and I were so pleased because the format remains the same, from stimulus material to stimulus material. And when we look at those prompts, they really are very easy to replicate because in RLA, it always tells our students or test takers that first they must analyze the argument presented by the author or different authors. In their response, they need to develop the argument where they have to explain how one position is better supported than the other. Of course, that always causes our students problems, as you know, because they keep questioning, won't I get a better score if I support one side over the other? Which is the best one to do? And you and I know that it really doesn't matter which side they take as long as they provide a reason for it being better supported. And that comes from incorporating relevant and specific evidence from the passage to support their argument. And again, we like the fact that they state clearly the better argued positions, not necessarily the one with which you may agree. And we know that, especially in RLA, where they have 45 minutes, that an effective response should be multiple paragraphs and multiple words. And although this is not, quote, written in stone, we do know that effective writing is going to have more than just 1 or 2 paragraphs. So as we look at the next slide and look at an actual RLA prompt, we can all see that it does follow that same process. And today as we look at different stimulus material, we're going to promise you that we're not going to look at daylight savings time, but rather we're going to look at a different set of articles to read. So here's the prompt that we're going to be working with, as not only do we read the materials, but we score actual student writing. And that prompt is that we want the writer to analyze the arguments presented in a press release and a letter to the editor, and then to develop an argument in which the writer explains how one position is better supported, of course, relevant and specific evidence from both sources, and telling them that neither side is the side that's going to get you the most points, but rather how you craft that argument. So if you look in your guide and you want to follow along, looking a little more closely at the stimulus material, it's on pages 8 and 9. Because we know as you're looking at that slide and saying, that font's a little bit too small for me to read, it is much easier if you go to the guide and look at it. You'll see one article that's taxation and revenue, and then the other one, which is on page 9, which is a letter to the editor. And Susan, you know, let's say you're a test taker, and the first thing you're going to do after you read the prompt is you're going to read the text. You're going to read that stimulus material. And if you do what, you know, research is telling us to do, you're going to actively read. You're going to interact with the text, and you're going to kind of, you know, think to yourself, okay, what's the evidence of this side, and what's the evidence of that side, so that when you come up with the claim, a really important part of trait 1, that you'll have a good solid claim. So how would you do that? How would you interact with this text?
Well, the first thing I'm going to do, and I'm glad you brought up the point a minute ago, is I am going to read that prompt first, because I really want to know, you know, so I can get my brain activated and I can think about things as I'm going through and reading this, and then I'm paying better attention to evidence and knowing I have to support things from both sides. But what I'm going to do is as I go through and do my initial reading, and I may read twice, but I'm going to do an initial reading and going to find out generally what this is about. But the other thing that I'm probably going to try to do as well, and I'm going to see if I can grab a pen here to do this with. Oops, wrong thing. I apologize. Is I'm going to take a look and I'm going to find different pieces of evidences here. Okay, so we're talking about this bill and what it does. And so I'm funding a 2-lane highway, moving it to a 4-lane thoroughfare. Okay, so that's a part of it. And then as I go on down through there, I find out that according to Representative Walz and this particular article, that this is going to ease traffic congestion and create job opportunities before and after construction. I think that's a pretty strong point if I'm looking for evidence of why this is a really positive thing to do. Now, okay, this Representative Walz had to do something in order to get this information together. And I noticed that there were town hall meetings. So that was finding out what the constituents were interested in terms of revitalizing the economy. Let's see. I can go back through here and I can make note of the fact, well, there was a big factory that closed its doors. That's another thing that I might want to do as well. And then as I move through, I'm still looking at how can this really be a positive thing. Well, I see some data, and it says some officials anticipate a 30% increase in highway traffic. Wow, well, if you got all that much coming through, maybe that's going to mean that we're going to get some new motels and restaurant chains along the highway, and that could lead to jobs. So, Bonnie, as I've gone through, what I've done is I've highlighted information, and since we know students on the test, they have a highlighting tool, I've highlighted to say, okay, these are things that I think are important that are in support of this new highway bill. So, and I would continue on through the rest of the passage. But now, maybe I need to take a look at the other side, because here's this letter from the editor, and I need to take a look and see, okay, what's this person's actual opinion on this, and what are the facts that are coming in from there? So again, I do the same type of thing where I'm going through and I'm reading, and oh, well, I found out real quick in that first paragraph that this person says this is not acceptable. But, okay, it's not acceptable. Why isn't it acceptable? Let's see. Oh, it's going to be paid with federal taxes. And this guy says he believes that's going to harm the town and that there are few residents of Oak Falls who will actually use that road. Oh, so his comment is that the town and district is going to lose money as a result of this. So that's important. If you're going to say it's unacceptable, then why? Okay, now what else to talk about? Because the other one was talking about jobs and how there would be a lot more jobs, but this person says, oh, that's only temporary, those road construction jobs. And then he's looking at, the only thing that's going to be remaining after that, if you have restaurants and hotels, might be minimum wage. Okay, but, oh, another point. It's going to bypass, the highway is going to bypass 4 cities in their district alone. And that could lead, and you know, a good point here in the way the letter of the, to the editor has been written, there's more explanation of why that bypass would be detrimental, and it may mean that they lose business because there's not as many people passing through. So what I've done throughout this, Bonnie, is I've actually gone through and I've highlighted evidence, and you know, I could take a graphic organizer now and I could sort out the pro side and the con side based on what I've read. Now I can put my argument together.
You know, I think that's a really good idea as we look at scoring. we need to really carefully read the stimulus materials that our students are going to use because, really as you were talking about all this, what I kept thinking in my mind was lots of evidence for both sides, but that evidence was including both fact and opinion. So as I'm reading my students' works, I really need to keep in the back of my mind that they've got to develop the argument and they have to cite evidence, regardless of which side, understanding that, some of that evidence may be hard fact, studies, etc., but some of it may be evidence that is the opinion of the writer. Of course, not my opinion, but the opinion of the writer. So I think those are really important things for us as we score materials. So let's look at scoring extended responses.
Well, and Bonnie, as I'm looking here at the PowerPoint and I'm looking at trait 1, that really is what everything is about. I mean, at the heart of this writing is that argument, but how do you make an argument if you don't have the evidence to go along with it?
So true.
So those two pieces really are connected, and if we can just from there begin to show how our evidence that we've selected really matches up with the claim that we've made, then I think we're going to do really well as we work through this. So, Bonnie, we're going to take a look real quickly at, and I know that we're not going to have time for everybody to read these, but hopefully as people go back and they have a chance to sit down and work with this so they can, we're looking here at a response to that stimulus that we just read, those two pieces that we just read. And what we need to do with this is we really need to, and I'm going to be quiet for just about 60 seconds, and I'm going to have people out there, if you would, quickly read just paragraph 1 of that RLA response 1, which is on page 10 in the workbook.
Now, we all know that when we are scoring any type of constructed response, and there are 3 traits, we need to read the whole writing 3 different times, each time focusing on one of the traits. So as you were reading this first paragraph, as you focused on trait 1, we all know that students need to be able to analyze or evaluate the issue and create either what we would call a claim, or sometimes we'll refer to it as a thesis statement. And of course, that should be in effective writing in the first paragraph. And then further on, of course, we want to make sure that they've provided text-based evidence and connections. So, Susan, in this first paragraph, where did you find the claim?
Well, actually, it is in that first paragraph, and it is the last sentence of that paragraph. And basically, I mean, the student has given a little bit of an intro, which is what we would expect, and then has said, while both sides make an acceptable case, the latter provides a stronger argument. So at this point, if I'm reading this, I want to know what this student is going to say in terms of the latter argument. Why is it stronger? I'm going to be looking for evidence that shows a stronger point to it. And, that I'm hoping I'm going to find as I move on through. And within this one, that student starts out on the very next paragraph, Bonnie, with one example is, and then goes into the explanation that federal tax dollars pay for the road, as it will incorporate 6 different states. Now, what's interesting about that is if you go just a little bit further into that paragraph, you see how the student is explaining that. What difference? Why is that making that a stronger point? And then, even though, I wouldn't necessarily have a student use another example for each paragraph, that still brings out a really nice flow to that because I'm getting another reason and evidence to support it, each time moving through. And within this, that evidence is connected back again to that's a stronger argument. It's a stronger argument, and here's why. That's what we really want our students to do as they move through, is to be able to take a look at that. And I think, too, Bonnie, I'm going to pull back over to the PowerPoint for just a moment, but there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind as we've looked at this. We have a claim that that student has made. The student then has given evidence and factual information backed by logical explanations and facts. There's a number of different things there. And then that student has also done what we call analysis and evaluation to show why something is stronger in a given position. This one also does something, though, that we see in that higher level writing, and it's about having a counterclaim. And that really to show, it's kind of a rebuttal to say, yeah, on that other one they had this statement, however. It's that type of thing that comes through. So having said all this, Bonnie, what do you think, what's your opinion about this writing?
I would have been thrilled had my students written this well for Trait 1, because this person really nailed it. A perfect writing sample? No. However, very effectively covered the items that Trait 1 says, and even finished up, doing something a little different with the claim that although both parties may very well have had the best interest of the district in mind, and either position could be correct, it is clear that the letter provides a better supported argument. And throughout, that's exactly what this writer has done. So, when I read the annotation from GDTS, it was not a surprise that this particular writing sample got a 2 for Trait 1.
And a well-deserved 2. I mean, the different features that we're looking through for throughout this entire paper. Well, let's take one more look at another RLA response. And Bonnie, this one's response 2. And again, we're going to pull back here and not talk for just 45 or 60 seconds. And those of you who are out there, if you would, take a look at RLA Response 2. That's on page 11. But again, just look at the very first paragraph. Bonnie, is there a claim?
Is this where I can say kind of, sort of? As I was reading this, I thought, okay, maybe we'll get there definitively, but it's evident that the writer is trying to generate this argument against the expansion. And there's some reasons why, but I don't get that strong feeling of whether, what's the rationale for why the letter writer against the expansion is better supported. So yes, kind of, sort of, but this particular writer seems to, quote, write around the claim instead of really stating it strongly so that the additional information, the additional evidence could be really strong.
I would agree with you on the kind of, sort of, because I think that's really what it comes down to here, is that we know the direction in which this writer is heading. However, it's just not a clear stated claim that I can look at and say, aha, that's it, and then have some expectations going forward. So, there is an attempt here. So this is not like, oh, I don't have anything at all. There is that move toward this one side of the argument. There's some evidence that's there, and there's a little bit of the evaluation piece that's going on. So certainly not the strongest writing, but, you know, when I start looking at some of this, the student has a ton of potential here.
Oh, definitely.
It just has to be more focused as we move through. And I would have been very pleased, as a matter of fact, to have seen a student who was headed in this direction because we have something with which we can work. And so I think that's a big deal for us, is that we're not going to see those two-level writings all the time. What we are going to see are things where our students have those beginning skills, and we have the opportunity to help them move that process along. But it really does come down to us as we evaluate their writing and looking at different components of it very independently, not trying to take a holistic look at this, but very independently, and see what's happening, because that will help us then plan our instruction. And maybe there's certain things that we focus on more strongly than others. So,
very definitely. And just for everyone, you have one more that we want to make sure that you do read after you finish the webinar, and that is response 3. And what Susan and I have gone through is 2 responses that got a score of a 2 and a 1, because both of them did either very well or attempted to analyze, evaluate the issue, set up the claim, and then provide text-based evidence and connection. And we want you to make sure that you do read those and see those items, because then when you go on to RLA Response 3, and the annotation says that this response was a summarization of source text, it will become very clear what we mean when we say that students are doing too much summarization and not enough evaluation or analysis of the source text.
well, I will say one thing. When it comes to RLA Response 3, there sure are some long paragraphs there.
Yes, there are.
But at the same time, though, it really is about getting back to what is Trait 1 truly asking us to do as we move on through. So let's talk, and I'm switching back over to the PowerPoint just quickly so we can take a look at some things here. And first of all, you know, now we're going to move into Trait 2. You know, at the heart of everything was Trait 1, because we have got to build from there. But after you start getting those basic components in, you got to develop. I mean, develop ideas and have a structure that makes sense, and as you're reading through it, and has purpose. And you know, the other thing I noticed, Bonnie, as we were looking at that one, I didn't see the word I in there.
No. It really is. The formal style was much more evident, actually, in both of the writings that we saw.
So I think, you know, maybe that point is coming across that we've got to move into that more formal style and away from thinking of our opinion and our thoughts on certain things, but what does the evidence tell us as we're moving through? And, you know, not to forget that last one, that we really use words to express ideas clearly. You know, this is a high school credential that our students are working to earn, and do they have the skills that they're going to need in order to do that? Just as a reminder, back on page 10 again, if you take a look at that response 1, you're going to see that that sense of organization is there. Like as Bonnie said, there are no I's in this one. It is very much in that response 1 written in a formal style. The vocabulary itself is certainly on up there, and maybe something we're not always used to seeing within our students, but very much welcomed as we go through. And just a few final points. One of the things that our students, that in response 1 that student did, is actually develop those ideas and use a lot of transitional devices. So we were able to logically flow through the ideas that were there and see where that student truly understood both source text and was able to, and wasn't just able, but had actually analyzed and evaluated. And those are important things as we're going through. Within your workbook, what you're going to find is you'll find annotations that go across the board here on RLA with those 3 responses. And Bonnie, that brings us to trait 3. And, you know, we tend to think that the grammar piece here, as we tend to call it, should be a piece of cake.
That is so true, and yet it has not been. And part of that is oftentimes we see students who at this level are not using varied sentence structure. Their writing is not very fluid, and although they may have some competency in basic grammar skills, conventions of standard English, and they may have limited errors, we keep hearing over and over, but I thought my students were doing better than that. And so that leads us to something that we heard about, many months ago now, called an earned zero. And so let's talk a little bit about why our students on trait 3 are getting earned zeros. And just as importantly, when we're scoring our students' work, what would an earned zero look like? Well, main reasons for earned zeros is that many of our students, they're choosing the right evidence, but they are quoting the material extensively. And oftentimes we call that plagiarism. And let's face it, we see a lot more of that as we have the internet going and students go to research something and they cut paste and we add a transition word here or we substitute a word there. But when you're really looking at the information, it is largely text material. It's not student writing. And so an earned zero, if there's just summarization or primarily paraphrasing of the information from one or more source text, is going to get a scoreable 0. But Susan, let's look at what in the world is actually meant by original text. And so in your webinar guide on page 13, you have some of the information that we're going to go over, but this particular slide comes back to good old DST. And the reason we brought this one up is Susan had done an analysis of the writing, and she started highlighting all of the text that really was lifted from the source text. That's what you see in bold. And when you start looking at that, you go, oh my goodness, can this student really put together a paragraph? Or can this student even put together a sentence that is his or her own words? And Susan, I believe that when you did this, about 50% of everything was lifted from the source text. Am I correct?
It was. In fact, you know, because we were hearing so much about this, and I thought, okay, let's see if I can find one, because we certainly had a number of different options that we could look at within the resource guide from GEDTS. And in going through this one, you know, we see that fallback position that many students have. Their idea of paraphrasing being, well, if I change a few words, if I add a couple of words to this, then I paraphrase what's there. So I really haven't lifted that text, I've paraphrased it. And so you can see that there are 3 sentences here, but each of them has 3 or 4 words that have been added to the beginning of it. The rest of it is totally from the source text itself. The only exceptions are those last 2 sentences, and unfortunately, Bonnie, those aren't the best sentences in the world themselves. So we just don't have enough to know at this point, does the student really have any command of those basic conventions of English? And so we have to, you know, really work on this piece, that there's nothing wrong with having a quote, with being able to paraphrase information, but paraphrasing and quoting is not just lifting everything and that's all I have. So we have to be really cautious with that. And I think if our students are just made aware of it, and within the classroom we know and we're checking back, you know, the GED testing service has provided us with new passages to use in the classroom for practice. I think if we keep checking back, we'll begin to pick up those things and can actually head off some of the problems that we're seeing out there.
Susan, if you would go to the guide one more time. We actually took a writing sample of the prompt that we've been discussing, and looked at another sample of a student who, I hate to say it, but got 0 points and earned 0 for trait 3. And when you look at that particular one, you'll see that there's highlighting galore as well. And those highlighted items indicate two things. One is non-original text that they've just lifted, but the other is summarization, where they did really little more than took a look at ideas and regurgitated, as oftentimes I say, the author's ideas. There's nothing new. There's no evaluative or analysis stance on those things.
And so, again, another great resource as you're out there working in the classroom is, you know, for many of us, and I know for Bonnie and I it's very true, we're both very visual learners. And so to see that with all in its glory of highlighting, you can actually say, oh, wow, there is so much here that I have to work with the student on different pieces. We have to understand where those problems are occurring as we're going through. So having said that, Bonnie, I'm going to switch back over just for a second. Just as a quick reminder on the trait 3 itself, you know, there's no expectation that this is going to be totally free of errors. It is a time situation. It's on-demand draft writing. If the student had an opportunity to set it aside for a while, come back to it, I'm sure that for many of them, they would see that, you know, there's some things to be fixed. But it does say to us, too, that when we're looking at trait 3, are our students actually proofreading what they've written? Because sometimes we can see that, you know, the student would not have missed certain things. They've just gone back and just cleaned up a little bit. And that's something that, again, has to be played into the timing issue as they're working with that. So, Bonnie, having said that, can we talk for just a few minutes about social studies itself? Because some of the same rules apply, but there's a little bit of a different spin on them. So could you talk first about the social studies prompts and a little bit about where we're headed here?
Definitely. And the good thing is, as Susan said, the rubric for scoring social studies is very similar to the rubric we saw for RLA. So first of all, let's look at that prompt. And you'll see that the format is a little different, because here it says, in your response, develop an argument about how the passage or the author's position reflects the enduring issue. Boy, that's a new word, Susan, that we didn't have in RLA. Okay, so I need to identify an enduring issue expressed in the quotation. And then I need to incorporate relevant and specific evidence from the quote, the passage type, my own knowledge of the enduring issue and the circumstances surrounding. We often say if the enduring issue is something of individual rights, let's say freedom of speech, historical background knowledge would not be that Susan doesn't want me to talk anymore and so she's impacting my right to free speech, but rather some historical background. Remember, as you're scoring for social studies, there's 4 basic themes of civics and government that are enduring issues. Individuals' rights versus the good of the community, separation of powers, checks and balances, and the state's rights versus federal powers. So as you're looking at trait 1, because it's going to look very similar to trait 1, make sure that that enduring issue is out there and that there's background knowledge on that enduring issue that gets incorporated. Now remember, social studies writing is not expected to be as lengthy as the one in RLA, because students will have 25 minutes instead of 45 minutes to complete that task. So Susan, let's look at the social studies prompt, an actual one that we're going to talk about. And again, it's some different stimulus materials than we've used in the past. And this prompt says, in your response, develop an argument about how the author's position in his letter reflects the enduring issue expressed in the excerpt from Federalist 51. Incorporate relevant and specific evidence from the excerpt, the letter, and your own understanding of that enduring issue that surround the Tonkin Gulf resolution. Susan, the first thing I notice is it doesn't tell me what the enduring issue is, so I'm wondering as I read through the stimulus materials if it's going to work that way. So let's take a look at the quote and the stimulus material. And you'll find this in your webinar guide, and it's page 16. For some of you, you may not have seen this particular stimulus material prior to today. And it is a newer material, and the writing samples that we're going to talk about scoring in just a moment, again, newer materials. But we wanted you to take that excerpt and see if you can figure out, first of all, what's the enduring issue? Susan, am I right, because you're my history major, when I read this, I see that the enduring issue is separation of powers. Am I correct?
Well, yes, you are. And in fact, as we look at this, if you look, you go there, the word separate, and we look at exercising different powers of government. And I think that's something that, we just have to have some time with students to practice. How do we help them extract that information from that so that we can move on from there? So what we've got in moving through this, now we have a letter that goes along with it. And again, what has that prompt asked us to do? Well, it's asked how that is reflected in the letter itself. So just as we did with the other one, with the RLA, as a student, I want to go through and I want to highlight information as I'm moving through to show how that is reflected within that letter. And I think that's what we need to do, is spend more time as we're working with our students on some of those close reading skills to make sure that students are understanding, how do I see the connection and really talk through some of these. That's one of the problems that many of our students have as they're moving through. They have difficulty in being able to, how should I think about this? What kind of questions should I be asking as I'm moving through? So that's another thing that we want to do as we're working with this. Now, Bonnie, I'm going to move over to take a look just very quickly at those three traits. In fact, I'll just stay right here on the workbook rather than going to the PowerPoint. But those three traits are the same as what we had for RLA, correct?
They are, with just a few minute differences. So as we're scoring for trait 1, you'll notice that students need to have a text-based argument. They need to understand relationships among those different ideas and the historical context. That's a little bit different. But they still need to cite relevant and specific evidence from both those sources. And they have to make sure that it is connected, that evidence is connected to the prompt and the source text as well as their text-based argument. So what I'm looking for with trait 1 is the argument, evidence from both sources, historical background knowledge, and that connection piece. But everyone probably notices that as they're scoring for trait 2 and trait 3, trait 2 is still development of ideas and organizational structure. That's not changed. And when you look at the kinds of skills students should exhibit, similar to what we saw in RLA. When you look at trait 3 on page 15, clarity and command of standard English, the same stuff. The only difference that I notice on these two is in trait 2 and trait 3, you can only score it a 1 or a scoreable 0. And when Susan and I first saw this, we thought, okay, it's because there's less time, they're more completely evaluating these two areas in RLA. So we kind of give it this little terminology that in trait 2 and trait 3, they either have it, they score 1, or they don't. And so here again, as you're scoring for social studies, really focus on trait 1, because again, we can give it a scorable 0, a 1, or 2, or of course non-scorable. But in trait 2, they either have it for development of ideas and standard English conventions, or they don't.
And so I think that's what we've got to focus in on within this one. Is again, trait 1 is really the driving factor.
Yes.
Can I read and can I respond to that prompt and meet the demands of trait 1? And so we're going to give you, again, that magic 60 seconds to read through paragraph 1 and tell us, well, you're not going to be able to tell us because you'd have to just raise your hand. But anyway, if you could, I want all of you who are out there to think in terms of, does this student in paragraph 1 truly exhibit an understanding of what that enduring issue is?
Susan, I think this test taker has identified it very clearly because he connects it or she connects it as the statement is made in regards to his vote with the minority of the Congress against this resolution. It reflects the issue of separation of federal powers outlined in the excerpt of Federalist 51.
Absolutely.
It can't be a whole lot clearer than that.
No, and in fact, what we have is within this first sentence where that student has said that, okay, I got it. It's separation of powers. Now what I'm going to expect as I move through is I'm going to expect that within the letter, within this response here, I'm going to see how that's reflected within that letter. So as those are the different pieces that I have to do. And as you have time when you're back in your programs and you have time to go through and take a look at this student has done a very masterful job of not only connecting to the source text itself, but in also making that connection from a historical standpoint. And, that's what is so essential, that as we're out there working with students within our classrooms, let's make sure that our students have that understanding of the Constitution itself and those enduring issues so that they can rely on their knowledge. Because as students, as this particular student in the second paragraph, we can actually see where the student takes it back to when the Constitution was written and goes on into information there about having different parts of government and having a system of checks and balances that go along with that. So this student has done a great job in terms of working with that. So I think as you have a chance to read it and go through and do what we've done here today as we've been going through this webinar, highlight, underline, circle. You can always print another copy of these different things, but we have to, as teachers, become more familiar with the material and also those examples that are out there so that we know what direction to head. Likewise, as we're going through, what we're seeing within this is, it's a clear argument of how the enduring issue is reflected into that source text. There's evidence from the letter that supports the analysis. And then, again, what makes it a 2 in this, what allows it to be a 2 in this one is it also has that writer's own knowledge of that historical context. So that makes a huge difference as we're going through, because remember, a student can score a 1 without that historical context, their own personal knowledge, but we want those students to be able to reach for that 2, and I know that's very doable as we work through the process itself. So
Okay, Susan, you said I scored it a 2 for trait 1, and personally I would definitely give it a 1 top score for trait 2 because the development details, etc., are wonderful, and very few grammatical errors, sentence structure errors, etc. So this person, in my opinion, has it for trait 3. So top scores everywhere?
Top scores everywhere.
But, you know, sometimes I worry as I start scoring that, you know, that one was really lengthy. What happens to my scoring mind if I see something shorter, like the one we have on page 19? I mean, is it because it's shorter I'm going to say, you know, I saw the first one and look at how long it was to get some score. How would I score page 19?
Well, I think there's a couple of things you have to keep in mind. What does the rubric tell you? The rubric says that I have to, 1, read it for trait 1. So irrespective of how long it is or how short it is, I go through and I look to see, did that student answer the question in moving through? Did that student respond to the prompt? And as you begin to read through this particular one, and in looking at this, yes, there is that argument, there's that understanding from the source text, and you can see even when it starts out, the author states that Congress has given some of its power to the president. And in Federalist 51, the student is talking about having those different branches of government, and each one has their own thing that they're supposed to be doing. So I'm beginning to see pieces there. I'm certainly not seeing what I saw in the other one, but I also don't need to be comparing one to the other. I need to be looking at this one on its merits. And what is it doing as I move through? What did this writer do? And what we can see is that, you know, the writer has continued on. However, what I seem to be missing here is that I'm not seeing that outside source, that background knowledge. And so I certainly don't have the depth that I have in the other one, but at the same time, I have evidence. I have that argument that has been set up that's included within here.
Okay, that makes sense. And this person really is connecting back to the prompt and text. So, but we're missing that piece, that one
yes, we
piece.
are. We're missing that piece. So I really go with a score .1 on this one.
Okay.
And, you know, then, but, you know, as I look through the rest of it, I might like to see some paragraphs in here, but overall there is some logic to this. It certainly is. It's written in a more formal style. The language is pretty good. So
good transition, too. I like the way the transition words are used.
There are some good transitions. So, you know, I can't say that this student doesn't have any of that. So I look at this as a 1 again.
For trait 2.
For trait 2.
Okay.
And then if I look at the last one, looking at trait 3, I can understand what the student is saying. There are some errors in here, but there's still different types of sentences, the sentence structures that are used. So, you know, you said they either have it or they don't. This one has it. I mean, maybe there's some areas where we could certainly strengthen things, but again, I would give it a 1.
Oh, and you know, the one thing I noticed here to give it a 1 in trait 3 is there is a lot of original text here.
Absolutely. And that's what we said earlier.
True.
That if you're going to copy all that stuff, well, then you're not going to get that 1. But that makes a difference as we're moving through. So, having said that, Bonnie, I think we need to talk about a couple of other things here, and then we're going to move on to some questions because I know there got to be people out there who are interested in some questions, and so we'll open it up. But remember, folks, as you're out there and you've got questions, send them into the chat, and you know, we'll try to move on through those. You have a lot of resources that are included in that particular workshop guide, the webinar guide, so please take advantage of those. use them, show them to your students, work with them in the classroom, and I think you'll find a lot of information there. What we really want to do, and to keep this in mind, is that we focus a lot on trait 1, and why should we be doing that? Well, because really that's pivotal. We can see from trait 1 if that student has an understanding of what they've read, that they're able to then turn that around, analyze, evaluate the information, and then come back and express it. It really shows how you can cross different areas, social studies and science. And what do we base anything on if we don't start from the beginning, that trait 1, the argument itself, and all the pieces that are being built from there? So you have some other tools that are out there, and I'm sad to say, Bonnie, I don't think they're getting as much use as they should be.
You know, I don't either, and most folks who, when we talk with them about scoring, say, I need something a little more definitive rather than the way you've talked us through the rubric. I want to make sure that when I score my students' work, it's going to be the same score that they would get if it were scored by GED Testing Service. So GED Testing Service looked at that rubric, and for lack of a better term, they broke it apart into very small, discrete parts, and they created something called the Educator scoring tool. And as Susan and I have worked with this tool, and as we've worked with teachers with this tool, we're going to be the first to tell you initially the tool's a little laborious. But with a little bit of time and a little bit of effort, what happens is if you use the scoring tool, you will have an accurate reflection of your students' writing. The other thing is it really gets you ingrained with what the rubric really is asking you to look at. So the scoring tool, and you have a copy that was included, although there's one for not only RLA, but also social studies and science. It's a wonderful tool because it breaks down what we call the dimensions of the rubric into those smaller, more easily definable subdimensions. Just remember that the tool has to be used just like you would use the rubric, and that is you will read 3 times, 1 for each of the traits. Now, having said that, if you're like Susan and I are, sometimes you don't score for all 3 traits, and that's perfectly fine, because that way, if I'm going to focus on my students doing trait 1, maybe I score trait 1 and make sure that they've nailed it before I go ahead. But as you're looking at those multiple reads, very similar that when you're editing a document, you may not read for everything at once. Realize that as you're using this scoring tool, there again, it will become easier with time. So Susan, let's look at a sample of that RLA Educator scoring tool and just look at the main sections of it.
Okay, I'm going to pull that one up so that we can take a look at the one for RLA. And as you go through what you'll see directions that come into those, but really take a look over here to the fact that we have our trait 1, we have dimensions and subdimensions, and notice how they have broken everything down. And then what makes it nice is that then as I'm reading, I can say, well, does this clearly state a claim? Is it kind of implied or is it explicit? I can determine those different pieces as I'm moving through. So you can see there are a number of different dimensions moving through trait 1. And then from there we go into trait 2. Same thing occurs looking at each of the dimensions as we move through the document itself. And you can see I have multiple dimensions and questions that I'll ask myself as I'm moving through. And then your final read, and it should be your final read, comes back to trait 3 and looking at it from clarity and command of standard English conventions. You do have to do some math in here because you're going to have to do some multiplication and then you're going to have to divide. So keep that in mind based on the number of subdimensions that are included. What we found in talking with a number of teachers who have used this scoring tool and use it on an ongoing basis is that after about 4 or 5 times of using it with different students writing, they found they were really internalizing the scoring rubric itself, and after that it was more of a reference if they needed to go back to it at some point, but they really had much clearer and much more confidence in doing the writing for those extended responses itself. So keep that in mind as you're going through, and I think you'll find that with just a little bit of work, you'll enjoy using it, and it'll have a lot of value for you. The Social Studies Educator Scoring Tool is set up in the same way as RLA, so go out to the GED Testing Service website and grab those different resources that are there. You have resource guides, you have scoring tools, you have a lot of information that's on the site, so please take advantage of that. And as we go through and we talk for just a couple minutes about a couple of other resources that are out there, we're going to go ahead and have them start to look and gather the questions. But they have done some updates with the Extended Response Resource Guide, so now you can see the annotations not just for one trait on a writing sample, but across the board. So download those if you haven't been out there in a while to take a look at some material. A couple of other things, just general information for you. There's going to be some new laminated boards going out when students are testing. Board 1 has a math formula reference sheet. It also has a calculator reference sheet, so they'll have those things in their hands starting in November. Also, they will have with them extended response answer guidelines for social studies and for RLA. Again, they're targeting at November 1 for shipment to those test centers itself. And, hey, keep up with the GED Testing Service website. They have been revamping and putting new resources in for you, and take advantage of them. We are so excited to have new practice prompts and source text all ready for you right out there on the GED Testing Service website. Plus the professional development and announcements and archives from different webinars, so lots of information that's available. And keep it all in mind that it is about our students. That's really where we want to go, and make sure that they have the resources and the practice to improve their writing and be able to earn those higher scores. So having said that, Bonnie, are you okay if we open up for questions at this point?
Definitely.
And I'm not sure who is going to be our question person coming forward, if that'll be Teresa or Mimi.
This is Teresa, and we do have a couple questions that have come in.
Wonderful.
The first one that has been asked by a number of people is, can you repeat the enduring issues for social studies?
Certainly. All of the 4 enduring issues fall into the category of civics and government. And so there are 4 of them. Individual rights versus the common good, separation of powers, checks and balances, and states' rights versus federal power. So the enduring issues will fall within those categories. And when we talk about individual rights, that could be everything from, the right to free speech, the right to assemble peaceably, those within those individual areas there.
Okay, great. Our next question, there are a couple parts to this, so I'll read the whole question, and then if you need me to repeat parts of the question, just let me know.
Okay.
Must the student specifically state and use the words better supported in their extended response? Is it 4 to 7 paragraphs or 5 to 7 paragraphs? They've seen it stated as both. And can the student indent, or should they double space the paragraphs?
Okay. Let's go back and repeat the very first part of your question.
All right. Must the student specifically state and use the words better supported in the extended response?
They would not necessarily have to use the word better supported. They could say that this claim is stronger, or, you know, this position
is backed by more recent
is backed by, I mean, you could
researches.
use other ways to say it. However, the bottom line is that within RLA, they are going to need to pick one side or the other to argue. So, but the use of the actual words better supported does not have to be there. They'll just say it in some other way, but that's the basic general context of it. Now, the second part I believe you said was, is it 5 to 7 or 4 to 6 or 4 to 7?
Both.
Both. Actually, and here's where Bonnie and I are going to maybe maybe we'll take a little credit or a little blame for this, Bonnie. Yes, there are a couple different things. What we want you to keep in mind is that 4 to 7 range is accurate. You know, the 5 to 7, it is not necessary for a person to hit that magic number of 5 or magic number of 6. But to be able to adequately respond to a question, a prompt like you would have in RLA, is more than a paragraph or two. But we don't want students to get into that habit of thinking in terms of a 5-paragraph essay where they're stating an opinion and 3 reasons for it. We don't want to go down that road. So 4 to 7, they're not going to lose a point. If they have a really strong response, and it's only 3 paragraphs, but it's really strong, and it hits all of the elements that are included in the rubric, they're not going to lose a point because it wasn't at the magic 4. So keep that in mind as you're going through and focus in on what is it that the student needs to do to answer the prompt. And in that case, they're going to need multiple paragraphs in order to do that.
And that's where you go back to the rubric and you look very strongly at the rubric and whether the student did an effective job on each of those subdimensions. And as Susan said, it is not just about length. It's about all of the other things that go in. Both of us have seen very lengthy writings that have gotten very poor scores because, again, the rubric showed that they did not have the skills that were being assessed. And you saw on the social studies there was a paragraph, very, very lengthy, but it did get points. Why? Because when you scored it according to the rubric, it was able to get tally marks in those areas where it had strengths.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing that we have to look at, is that we have to address the issue within our programs that writing is not about quantity, it is about quality. And, you know, if we work with students to build that first trait in social studies and in RLA, our students are going to do well. They really will. And some of them will say it in a more concise way than others. But what we want them to do is make sure that they're making that argument, they're supporting it with evidence, and that they're showing the connection between the evidence and the claim itself. Those are essential ingredients as they're moving through. And the last part?
The last part was, can the student indent or should they double space the paragraphs?
If they want to indent, they can, but they don't have a tab button to do that with, and so that means they're going to have to space over in order to do it. Quite honestly, it's easier to just do block,
Hard
to do it in a block manner and have a double space in between each paragraph to show there's a division in there. That would make it easier for the student without thinking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I remember that from typing class, Bonnie. Space 5 times over. You know, but those are that dates me, doesn't it? Typing class.
Yes, it does.
Okay. Well, anyway, but that's one of the things that, you know, let it be easier for students. There's no requirement for indenting, and that's not in the scoring mix at all.
Okay. One other question that came in is they wanted to know how you can get your students to actually unpack the prompt and use the highlighter like you had mentioned in the webinar.
We had done a number of those things in a previous webinar where we actually have a graphic organizer for unpacking the prompts, and then some graphic organizers for even not only working with the text, actively being engaged, but then identifying the different evidence segments, putting it for both sides into a graphic organizer, and from there determining which side is better supported and creating the thesis statement or claim. So a couple of those things are on the web from the previous webinars that we've done along with materials. But also if there's additional resources that anyone needs, please contact GD Testing Service so that we can have those to you.
One of the things I just did is I pulled back to the RLA prompt.
Yes.
And so kind of keep this in mind because some of you may not have been with us, and so you can certainly go into the webinar archives and you can find it. But what I would do with students in the classroom is you have to model for students so they can see how this process works and then they can replicate that. So I've pulled back to the RLA prompt. And as Bonnie said, we have a little activity that's included in one of the others. It's called Do What. And so basically my focus is going to be on the verbs. And I'm going to have students find the verbs within the prompt. And then from there, okay, I'm analyzing. What am I analyzing? The argument. Next verb, I develop. What am I developing? Well, I'm developing an argument in which I have to do what? Oh, I have to explain how one position is better supported than the other. Then I have to incorporate what? Evidence from both sources. And then I'm going to take approximately 45 minutes to complete. And I know that I'm going to have multiple paragraphs. So that's how I would approach it, but I think by being able to take what you have today from here and take that into the classroom and use it as you model going through reading and underlining and highlighting so that students then can see how to do that.
Okay. A next question that came in was specifically regarding the responses that were on page 10 and 11, and they were curious what the scores were for both of those responses.
Okay, the annotations are at the back of the book itself, out of the guide. So if you actually go and start with
Page 20.
I'm so glad you're fast with this because I'm not. As we go through, when we get to, and I will get back over here again, you have the social studies stimulus material is included in there and the social study responses. And remember, there are two of them, so make sure you read both. Okay, there's your annotations for RLA response 1, each one of the 3 traits. And then on the next page is response 2. Then you have response 3. And then last but not least, you have social studies response 1 and then response 2. This, to me, I am so thankful for the people who put these annotations together. Because it's fine for me to understand, and I know Bonnie and I have had a lot of time to work with the rubric and the scoring tool and all that, but I really like to see the experts' analysis to see, am I matching up with this? Am I seeing what they saw? And for me to better understand it. So thank you for that question, and make sure at the back of your resource guide that you take a look at those.
And actually tying into that, we have a question that came in that asked if these new materials are from the resource guide that was published in August.
Okay, these particular materials actually are not in that resource guide. Because if you're looking back to the one that we were talking about, these are brand new materials. And yes, they just came out in August. And because when we're looking, oops, I'm sorry, I'm trying to go to the correct one without making everybody dizzy, but I'm afraid that I'm going to. You do have the resource guides that deal with the ones from daylight savings time, and then you have new materials that are out there now.
And another question that came in is, where are the educator scoring tools available? And actually, I can go ahead and re-chat the link that they are available in. But if you're looking for a link for the educator scoring tools, go ahead and look in the chat section, and that will be there.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just one thing to keep in mind is any of you who are out there and you're wanting to know where just a wealth of information is located, when you go to GEDtestingservice.com, if you'll go under educators and then for the educators, you'll see underneath that teaching and scoring tools, and there are just so many resources that are available there. So, you know, Teresa, thank you so much for going in and showing that specific link, but there are also other ones there too, and take advantage of all of those different resources.
And the final question that has come in is, could someone please explain how any points earned on the extended response for RLA or social studies are incorporated into the overall score for the actual test? I understand the points are not raw points, and they're actually added into the total score, correct?
Okay, the points that they earn within this, they can earn their raw points, raw score points. So as Bonnie was going through and talking about RLA, the student can earn 6 points, because you can get a 2, 2, and a 2, and then that's weighted. So it's that number, whatever that number is weighted by 2, and that gives them 12 raw score points as a possible. Now, there is some magic formula out there that converts raw scores into scale scores, and that is something that none of us have any information. We're not privy to that. That is within the scoring system itself. However, keep in mind that roughly 20% of the RLA score, the extended response represents about 20% of that test. So Bonnie says that I think the best of everybody, would you want students to walk away from 12, conceivably 12 points? And my answer would be no. I would want students to earn as many points as possible because I want to push that score. In social studies, they can earn 4. That again is weighted, so it's multiplied by 2. That gives them 8 raw score points, and then again, likewise, that's converted over into the scale score. And it, too, represents about 20% of the test. So, you know, we want our students to earn as many points as possible in working through that. And I think knowing that percentage really helps us kind of gauge, you know, how we work with students. Because the other thing to this, too, is we talk about the importance of reading. And the stronger readers are going to do even better on other parts of those 2 tests, because they're able to analyze and evaluate information and respond to multiple choice questions or other questions that they're asked. So there's a payoff in a number of different ways.
And along the same vein, we had a question come in. Can you pass the social studies test if you do not answer the extended response?
You can, yes. However,
would you like them to skip 8 questions?
I really, you know, yes, you can. You can pass it. However, what we find with a lot of students that are out there is, you know, that they just are not going to answer all those other questions correctly. And, you know, so, and you're putting a pretty heavy weight on them when you take 20% of that test away by not having, any of the writing. But yes, it can be done, and it is done. There are different students who pass, and they don't earn anything on their writing. But, what we want to do is keep students working at it, because we know that that's beyond passing the test. There are going to be other needs for evidence-based or argument-based writing, and so that's what we're trying to do here, is give them those tools and those skills that they'll use later on.
And we just had a question come in asking where the graphic organizers are that you've used in the past. And again, I can chat the link to
Wonderful.
the
Perfect.
Exploring the Test webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And those are all the questions that have come in.
Well,
And I was going to say, and we are
that,
almost at the end of our time, Susan, so I guess that's perfect.
I guess so. I will ask if there's anything, if Daphne, I know is with us, if there are any words that she has, anything she wanted to add into this that we may have missed along the way. Daphne?
Yes. Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, Susan, for a wonderful hour and a half. And I would just want to echo what Susan said about student performance. It shouldn't be about they're giving us the minimum, but they're giving us their maximum performance. And I think that the point is well taken about writing being a life skill that they will need beyond just passing this test, but whether they go to work or whether they go on to training programs or to college, they're going to need to be able to write well. It's the #1 complaint that employers have about their young adult hires, that people don't know how to write. And it's a mistake to think that people in entry-level positions aren't asked to write, because they are. So I really, really want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and keep the questions coming. We are happy to get answers because we know inquiring minds want to know. So enjoy the rest of your day. And again, on behalf of GED Testing Service, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, ladies. That does conclude the call, everyone. You disconnect.
Thank you.